Hi guys, going over chapter 6 for this recording, the endocrine system. This is one of the two organ system in the body where it controls all other organ system, remaining organ systems. So we have 12 organ systems in physiology, 13 if you split the reproductive into male and female. So the endocrine system controls all other organ system except the nervous system, right? And the endocrine system we learned from previous recording relies on chemical messengers that are called hormones um, to communicate with all other organ system and to induce them to carry out functions that are dictated by this endocrine system. We're going to go over how the organ system is organized, so under structural organization, followed by some specific structure function correlates. So the importance of the hypothalamus, and hypothalamus is a neural structure from anatomy. So it is part of the nervous system, but it controls the entire endocrine system. So the hypothalamus is the big boss, if you will, the master switch of the endocrine system over here. ES stands for endocrine system, right? The hypothalamus. And we're gonna go over another important endocrine structure, the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland from anatomy again has two parts, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. So we're gonna go over that today, at least from the functionality aspect of this important endocrine gland. For a long time, we thought that the pituitary gland was the big boss of the endocrine gland. Within the endocrine system, the most important organ is the pituitary gland. But now we know the pituitary gland is not the master switch of that organ system. It is actually the hypothalamus that controls all other endocrine organs or endocrine structures, despite the fact that the hypothalamus is not even part of the endocrine system. It belongs to the nervous system. So we're going to go in detail about that. How is it possible for the hypothalamus coming from the nervous system and then controlling the functions of the entire organ system that we call endocrine system? And then under homeostasis, we're going to go over some feedback mechanisms used to release hormones. So we do have, for example, reflex. So when we think about reflex, we just think about the nervous system. But in the endocrine system, we do have endocrine reflexes as well. So we're going to go over that. So introducing to you the endocrine functions before the nervous system, which is beginning in chapter 7, which is on the menu for the next recording. But for today, focusing on the endocrine system. When we talk about the endocrine system, there are what is called pure endocrine organs, meaning that's all they have. They have is producing and releasing hormones. So we have a single pituitary gland, we have a single pineal gland, we have one thyroid gland, and I mentioned during a prior recording, the parathyroid gland, we have anywhere from 4 to 8 parathyroid glands. And in your book, it shows the relationship between the thyroid and the parathyroid. And that would be on page 154, figure 6.8. So if you go there, the thyroid, is anterior and the parathyroid glands are located posterior to the thyroid gland. So they're located behind the thyroid. Um, so they're not accessible, they're not that visible. You need to basically um, peel off the thyroid and take a look at the back side of the thyroid to see these parathyroid glands. And later in the lecture, you're going to see their importance, the parathyroid glands. And then we have two adrenal glands. They're sitting superiorly to each kidney. So above each kidney, you have an adrenal gland. So we're going to go over that as well. So there's two different layers of tissue in there. You have the superficial adrenal cortex and the deeper adrenal medulla, producing and releasing different types of hormones under different scenarios, and that's also part of today's lecture. And then finally, we mentioned neuroendocrine organ, the hypothalamus controlling the entire endocrine system. There are also other structures, other organs that are not belonging to the endocrine system. They belong to other organ systems, yet they produce and secrete hormones. So they do have endocrine functionality, but that's not their main job, right? So for example, the thymus. So this picture is on page 150 of your book, figure 6.1. The thymus is located anteriorly and superiorly to the heart. That thymus is a lymphatic organ, but it does produce hormones. Another example is the pancreas. This is a digestive organ. So 99% of pancreatic cells are involved in producing and releasing, secreting digestive juice that we call pancreatic juice, that we're going to go over when we begin to discuss the digestive system. Only 1% of all the pancreatic cells do have endocrine functionality, meaning producing and releasing or secreting hormones. Again, we're going to go back and talk about that. Highlighting, for example, the pancreas relying on a negative feedback mechanism to control the blood concentration of glucose by releasing hormones, insulin and glucagon. We also have gonads. These are called testes in males and ovaries in females. They are part of the reproductive system, yet they do have also endocrine functionality, meaning they do produce chemical messengers. They do produce and release hormones into the bloodstream. So those are examples of organs that belong to other organ systems, yet they do have um, endocrine functions. Another example is also shown on the picture is your heart. The heart is part of a cardiovascular system, yet it secretes hormones and dumps them into the bloodstream. Same thing for the stomach, liver. Both the stomach and the liver are part of the digestive system, and they do also secrete hormones. Kidneys, part of the urinary system, which is the only organ system handling our cellular waste. So the kidneys secretes hormones, and those hormones, one of which is very, very, very important, helping the body to maintain blood pressure on long-term basis. And we get to learn about them also when we talk about the urinary system toward the end of the semester. And then the small intestine, obviously, it belongs to the digestive system, yet it also produces and secretes hormones into the bloodstream. And then one structure, finally, which is pretty unique and remarkable, is the placenta. The placenta also produces and releases hormones. And the placenta is the only structure, the only organ in the human species where it contains tissues coming from two distinct individuals, yet the mother is tolerating it. So in other words, the immune system, the mom's immune system is not rejecting the placenta, despite the fact that the placenta contains fetal tissue, so tissue coming from the fetus, which is a distinctive, unique, genetically unique human being. Um, Normally, under normal circumstances, the host immune system would reject anything that's present within the host. For example, if you receive an organ transplant, that heart that you receive from the donor ultimately would be rejected by your immune system. So we have this placenta, which basically comes online, if you will, active at week 8. So after 2 months after the embryonic development period, the placenta, comes online and takes over for the fetal development. So protecting and feeding and allowing the fetus to develop. And that placenta is not being destroyed by the mother's immune system. So this is a unique case where a structure containing a tissue that is not coming from the host, yet the immune system of the host is not rejecting it. So that's a note that I just wanted to mention before we move on into the detail for the lecture. So that was the gist for today's lecture. So again, going over a very important organ system, the endocrine system, controlling other organ systems through chemical messengers, through the release of hormones into the bloodstream. Okay, with that said, let's get the ball rolling. So let's begin with the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus controls the entire endocrine system, but by keeping a leash on three targets. The hypothalamus releases chemical messengers that target the anterior pituitary gland. So the anterior pituitary. It also uses the posterior pituitary as a storage site. We also mentioned that already. So that posterior pituitary stores two hormones that were produced by the hypothalamus. We're going to come back to that. So keep that in back burner. And the third target is the deeper region inside each adrenal gland. We call the adrenal medulla. So two or more adrenal medullae with an E at the end for plural. And take out the E, it becomes singular, adrenal medulla. So this is how the hypothalamus controls the entire endocrine system. So you have the first pathway, hypothalamus controlling the anterior pituitary, the posterior lobe, here, that's the posterior lobe. Oops. So posterior lobe, here. You have the anterior pituitary here. You have the posterior pituitary here. And the third target the adrenal medulla. The deeper layers of tissue. So I'm going to highlight them in green. That's the adrenal medulla. You also, have the posterior lobe shown here. So those are the three targets for the hypothalamus, a neural structure, right? A structure belonging to the nervous system that functions as the master switch, the big boss of the endocrine system. Okay, so let's focus on the signaling mechanism by which a hypothalamus controls these three targets. So these two slides go hand in hand, so it's important. Chemical messengers released by the hypothalamus, they are called regulatory factors. Right. So these are chemical messengers produced and released by the hypothalamus, regulatory factors. And the regulatory factors, we have two types. We have the releasing hormones, RH, and we have the inhibiting hormones, IH. So let's start with the releasing hormones. So let's start with the second one, the CRH here, corticotropin. RH stands for releasing hormones, CRH. Right? So the CRH is produced by the hypothalamus. So you have your hypothalamus producing this CRH, and the CRH would be released into the bloodstream, and it will get to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Right? Now, the vascular bed connecting between the hypothalamus to the APG, anterior pituitary gland, or the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So this here, VB, vascular bed, is pretty unique. Okay, VB, right? Vascular bed. And this vascular bed is called hypophyseal hypophyseal. Can't spell now. Portal system. Hypo. Oh my God. Okay. Wake up, dude. Hypophyseal. Okay. Hypophyseal. Hypophyseal portal system. Portal, Portal, system, System. The hypophyseal portal systems means you have a vascular bed here connected by a blood vessel to another vascular bed and connected to another vessel. Now, capillary bed has multiple blood capillaries. For simplicity, I'm drawing only 2 capillaries here for you to see. So blood goes in this way, flows through like this, goes through here. That's a capillary. Same thing here, capillary, and it comes back out here. Same thing here, goes through here. Goes through here, comes back out. This is capillary bed number 1. This is capillary bed number 2. For the hypophyseal portal system, capillary bed number 1 is in your hypothalamus. So hypothalamus produces these hormones, regulatory factors, and then they travel to the CB2. In this case, CB2 is APG, anterior pituitary gland, or the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And the blood vessel that connect the 2 capillary beds this here, it's called a portal vein. Portal, Portal, portal vein, VEIN. So every portal system consists of back-to-back capillary bed. So the first capillary bed is located in the hypothalamus. The second capillary bed is located in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus released regulatory factors into CB1, and they're using CB1 through the portal vein to go to CB2, which perfuses the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And this is how the hypothalamus can control the release of the hormones coming from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So once we describe the anatomy of the portal system, let's appreciate the functionality of it. Because so far, that's just pure anatomy. Hopefully you've learned about them during anatomy class. Okay. So if CRH is produced and released by the hypothalamus. CRH uses the portal system, the hypophyseal portal system, to get to the anterior pituitary gland. And once the anterior pituitary gland receives the CRH, it will produce and it secretes into the bloodstream ACTH. And ACTH will go to the bloodstream and it will target the adrenal cortex, the superficial layer in the adrenal gland. And once it hits the adrenal cortex, it induces the adrenal cortex to release steroid hormones. Steroid hormones means these hormones are fat soluble, right? So they would not be compatible with water. Since they're fat soluble, if they are messenger hormones, steroid hormones, they go straight through the cell membrane. They go straight through the plasma membrane. So they don't need the assistance of a transmembrane protein that is physically located at the cell membrane or the plasma membrane to bind with them. So for these steroid hormones, their receptors are physically located either inside the cytosol of the cell or inside the nucleus of the cell. And they are powerful because they can shut down gene expression. They can amplify gene expression because they have access, they have direct access to the control center of a cell. In this case, it's the nucleus, due to the fact that they can cross over any phospholipid bilayer, whether you have that phospholipid bilayer at the membrane or whether you have that phospholipid bilayer within a membranous organelle. Okay, so that's the relationship between CRH and ACTH. Let's go back to the hypothalamus. So now let's switch to the first one, thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. When you hit the TRH, release the TRH and it hits the anterior pituitary, it will induce the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, THH. And then the other one, the gonadotropin, GnRH, it induces anterior pituitary to release two hormones, not just one. So under the influence of GnRH, anterior pituitary release two hormones, the luteinizing hormone and FSH, a follicle stimulating hormone. So we're going to come back to them when we talk about the reproductive system, especially for the female reproductive system, the important functions of follicle stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormone. And then prolactin, released by the hypothalamus, affecting the anterior pituitary, induces the anterior pituitary to release prolactin, PRL. And prolactin induces the mammary gland to produce milk. That's for lactating mothers. And then finally, growth hormone, releasing hormone, induces the anterior pituitary to produce and release growth hormone. And then the pars intermedius between the anterior and posterior lobes. You're going to learn it as is. There's a melanocyte stimulating hormone, but focus on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Now, there are neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, and this is showing you that hypophyseal portal system. And so you have your hypothalamus here. You have your infundibulum, which is the stalk connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. So deep within the infundibulum, you have your first capillary bed. So this is what we call CB1 earlier. And this is CB2 in the anterior pituitary. CB2, okay? And you have your portal vein here. And this system, again, is called the hypophyseal portal system. We get to see another portal system later in the semester when we talk about the digestive system. Under that system, it's called hepatic portal system. So within the hepatic portal system, CB1 would be the capillary bed perfusing the small intestine, specifically the jejunum, and CB2 would be the capillary bed perfusing the liver, right, inside the liver. And that portal vein would basically convey, absorb nutrients from the small intestine, more specifically in the jejunum region, and bring it to the liver for detoxification purposes. And that's under that system, it's called a portal, hepatic portal system. And in this case here, it's hypophyseal portal system. These neurosecretory cells are actually neurons that are producing chemical messengers. And these chemical messengers, since they're released into the bloodstream, they are no longer called neurotransmitter. They are called regulatory factors. In other words, they are hormones, right? These are for long distance communication. It allowed these neurosecretory cells from the hypothalamus to communicate with cells down into the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So distantly, they are not next to each other. So because of that, these chemicals that they are released are not called neurotransmitters. They are called regulatory factors, but the factor is they are hormones. So which type of hypothalamic neurons produce regulatory factors? For the hormones, the regulatory factors that affect the anterior pituitary gland, I will accept simply neurosecretory cells. But for the posterior pituitary, there's only two hormones. So I'm going to ask you to know, because the nuclei are different. And for the two hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary gland, the two hormones are called ADH, or AKA ADH. The hormone is also known as vasopressin. And the other hormone is called oxytocin. The oxytocin is produced by neurons that are located in the supraoptic nucleus. Supra means above, optic means the optic nerve or optic chiasm. In this case, they are above the optic chiasma. And then the ADH is produced by neurons that are located in a nucleus called paraventricular nucleus. This is next to the third ventricle. And those two specific names are shown on figure 6.3 on page 151 of your textbook. This is also straight from your book, and you're going to learn it as is, and that's from page 152, figure 6.5. So it shows you, again, one more time briefly, you have what is called a hypothalamic trophic hormone. These, we call them earlier regulatory factors, RF, either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. So the regulatory factors are RH here, releasing hormone, inhibiting hormone, IH, releasing hormones, RH, releasing hormone, RH, releasing hormone, RH, inhibiting hormone, IH, and releasing hormone. Okay. Let me go back. I think I forgot something. I did. So I forgot to mention about the inhibiting hormone. So the regulatory factor is known as inhibiting hormones. So if the hypothalamus sends prolactin inhibiting hormones to the anterior pituitary gland, then the anterior pituitary gland will stop producing prolactin. Right? So prolactin would be, the production of prolactin would be inhibited. If the hypothalamus sends down the growth hormone inhibiting hormone, then the anterior lobe will basically shut down the production and the release of growth hormone. That's why it's called inhibiting hormone. So regulatory factors, we have releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. I just want to make sure that it's clear, right? So when we talk about regulatory factors, there are two types: releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. So it means they either induce the anterior lobe to release pituitary hormones, or they inhibit the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary gland, to release its pituitary hormones. So the name tells you what it does. And then once these regulatory factors go through the hypophyseal portal system here, your book calls it hypothalamic pituitary portal vein, but that's part of the portal vein is part of the hypophyseal portal system. So you can say hypophyseal portal system, or you can say hypothalamic pituitary portal system. So these regulatory factors, either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones, will go and target the anterior pituitary. So prolactin would induce anterior pituitary to release prolactin. So prolactin releasing hormone induces anterior pituitary to release prolactin. Prolactin inhibiting hormone induces anterior pituitary to stop producing prolactin. TRH induces the anterior pituitary to release TSH. TSH, so prolactin targets the breast for milk production. TSH, the name indicates it, targets the thyroid gland. ACTH, we talked earlier. CRH induces anterior pituitary to release ACTH, targets the adrenal cortex, releasing cortisol. This is one specific example of steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are fat-soluble hormones. These are fat-soluble chemical messengers that goes through all types of phospholipid bilayer, cell membranes or plasma membranes, or the membranes of intracellular organelles, including the double membrane architecture of the nuclear envelope. I have no problem getting all the way through the nuclear envelope and get inside the nucleus. Growth hormone, targeting the liver and cells throughout the body for cell growth, inducing cell division. And then these are the two hormones targeting the gonads, both male and female. And we're going to go and talk about them when we talk about the reproductive system. So this is how the endocrine system control other organ systems through the release of long distance chemical messengers we call hormones. So they are all released into the bloodstream and they all affect their targets that are physically located farther away from the anterior pituitary gland. Let's begin with the adrenal gland. So the adrenal medulla, which is the deeper regions inside each adrenal gland. So that's, I'm going to highlight it, all of that in blue. That's your adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla secretes chemical messengers. And remarkably, these chemical messengers can act both as a neurotransmitter or hormone, depending on which cell secretes them, whether in a synapse, in a neuromuscular junction, in a glandular junctions, of which they will act as a neurotransmitter. If they are released into the bloodstream, which is in this case, then they are acting as hormones. And both adrenaline and noradrenaline are classified under a larger umbrella term. They are called catecholamines. Adrenaline is also known as epinephrine, and noradrenaline is known as norepinephrine. Epinephrine, E P I N E P H R I N E, epinephrine. and norepinephrine, NOR, and the word epinephrine. So those are identical names for the same chemical. So you can call it adrenaline slash epinephrine, or you can call it noradrenaline slash norepinephrine. So the adrenal medulla produces and secretes 80% of the catecholamines are epinephrine. 1/5, 20% are norepinephrine. And they're released into the bloodstream. And the cells that produces and releases these epinephrine and norepinephrine, they are called modified ganglia or a modified ganglion. So they are not, how would I say this? Ganglionic neurons. They have changed, and their name now is chromaffin cells. Chromaffin, CHROMAFFIN, chromaffin cells. So these are modified ganglia producing adrenaline slash epinephrine, producing noradrenaline slash norepinephrine, and release them into the bloodstream. And this occurs under emergency situations. This is what happens, and we know this as the adrenaline rush, right? So once these chemicals are released in the bloodstream, epinephrine and norepinephrine, they will increase your heartbeat, meaning your heart rate. It will make your heart beat faster. It will make your heart contract stronger. We're going to learn all of that in detail in cardiovascular system. But for now, let me describe some of them. It will induce you to breathe faster, to take deeper breaths too. It will also dilate the blood vessels that are perfusing your skeletal muscles, allowing your skeletal muscle to receive more oxygen, more nutrients, and dispose faster carbon dioxide and cellular waste, because these skeletal muscles are ready for action. This is prepping your body to face an emergency situation, potentially a life and death situation, right? This is also known as fight or flight scenarios. So it can be potentially dangerous, or it can be as mundane as, being embarrassed. So let's say you ask someone, Friday night bars, you like someone, right? And you go over and you ask his or her phone number. This is where you will basically induce a fight or flight situation in your body. You run late for class, same thing, fight or flight scenarios kicks in. You sleep through a lecture and then the instructor calls you out, completely embarrassed by it, fight or flight scenarios. Right, so those are conditions where every time the adrenal medulla releases catecholamines into your bloodstream. Right now, I know it's all descriptive, but when we talk, for example, cardiovascular system, we go into molecular detail. You will get to know how is it possible for a single molecule epinephrine, which is a water-soluble chemical messenger, water-soluble hormone. Since it cannot go inside the cell, how can it induce, for example, a smooth muscle to contract? So we're going to go in detail about it. There are receptors, there are names, there are signaling cascades, the whole 9 yards. It's a beautiful story But we have to wait until we get there, and then we can appreciate it. So this right now is just building that foundation, and then we amplify it going toward when we talk about these guys, chemical messengers, acting on their respective receptors and inducing these unique cellular cascade, signaling cascades, inducing this, for example, ultimately the smooth muscle or cardiac muscle to contract? Or how do they induce your heart rate to increase your heart rate? All of that. Okay, so that's for the adrenal medulla. Moving on to the adrenal cortex, which is the superficial layer. So if you go back, the adrenal cortex would be all this area here on the outside. That's the adrenal cortex, right? All of that. So this is anatomy. I'm assuming that you learned that from anatomy. So the superficial layer of tissue is called the adrenal cortex, which is on the next slide. Now the adrenal cortices, so 2 adrenal cortices, 1 adrenal cortex, they release steroid hormones. So adrenal cortical hormones are in fact steroid hormones, fat soluble hormones. And we have 3 families of steroid hormones: the mineralocorticoids, the glucocorticoids, and the gonadocorticoids. The mineralocorticoids, they're involved in maintaining homeostasis of salts, most important of which, sodium. Glucocorticoids maintaining homeostasis of blood glucose. So I'm going to ask you to know the most important hormones of each family. For the mineralocorticoids, aldosterone. For the glucocorticoids, cortisol. And the gonadocorticoids, DHEA. This DHEA here, it's a major androgen. Androgen means it's a male sex hormone, but it can be converted into female sex hormone called estrogen. And this is important for women undergoing menopause because estrogen protects their heart and protects their bones. The problem is estrogen is usually under, when they're younger, when they're not under menopause, these estrogens are produced by their ovaries. And once they hit menopause, the ovaries are no longer working, so they would be compromised in terms of estrogen production. So nature takes over the only source for female estrogens in the female's body during menopause. They have to extract it from their adrenal cortices coming from this DHEA, and it would be converted into female estrogens to protect their bones, to protect their heart. And sometimes it's not enough. So it depends on each person. That's why, sometimes it requires a hormonal therapy replacement to basically compensate for the lack of estrogen productions in the patient. Okay, and going back to the sodium, some cells spends half of all their energy to maintain that sodium homeostasis. The reason is, like I said earlier, wherever salt goes, water follows. So if you basically take care of salt, in this case sodium, for example, sodium chloride, then water, you take care of water also. So if you want to retain water, you keep the salt. If you're gonna get rid of water, get rid of the salt. Yeah? That's one of the most basic, fundamental thing about this concept, where wherever salt goes, water just follows. And this is due to osmotic pressure. And once the adrenal cortices release the steroid hormones, you are under long-term stress. When the adrenal medulla releases adrenaline slash epinephrine, releases noradrenaline slash norepinephrine, that's under short-term stress. The fight or flight scenario, that's the short-term stress. But when your body is being subjected to long-term stress, the adrenal cortices take over. They release these three families of steroid hormones: the mineralocorticoids, the glucocorticoids, and the gonadotropins. And this is just really easy points if I should ask during a test. These are the three different layers in the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex. And you have here the three zones: the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, zona reticularis. So learn it down here straight. So each zone have the most important types of steroid hormones, right? Most of them produce multiple types, but for example, the fasciculata here, the most important one is the glucocorticoids. Steroid hormones are involved in maintaining glucose homeostasis. The reticularis is the deepest layer, meaning closest to the medulla, involved in producing gonadotropins, steroid hormones that will become sex hormones. And the superficial one, close to the capsule of the adrenal gland, they produce mineralocorticoids, steroid hormones involved in maintaining electrolyte homeostasis. So when we talk about hormones, we can talk about it takes two to tango. You need the hormone, you need the chemical messenger, right? When we say hormone concentration, we are talking about the chemical messenger, CM. But when you have a chemical messenger, it's not enough. You need a second component, and that's the receptor. So it takes two to tango, right? So in order for the target cell to respond to that chemical messenger, that target cell needs to have a receptor. If the chemical messenger is water soluble, the target cell needs a receptor at the plasma cell membrane. If the chemical messenger is fat soluble, all the target cell has to do is have a receptor in the cytosol or a receptor in the nucleoplasm inside the nucleus. So there are factors that can affect a hormone, a response to a hormone. So a response, I don't know how the cell responds to a hormone. So the concentration of the chemical messenger. So how much of these chemical messengers are present at the cell, at the target cell? If they're water soluble, they're accumulating outside the cell. If they're fat soluble, they're inside the cell. The second player is how many receptors does the target cell display? We call that receptor density. And then finally, the third component is the influence by other hormones. And this is an important concept. So once hormones arrive at the target cells, oftentimes there are other chemical messengers that are also there simultaneously. And then there are three types of influences exerted by other hormones. They can oppose one another, antagonistic effect. They can help each other, synergistic effect. Or they can allow one hormone function is being allowed by the presence of another hormone. That we call permissiveness effect. Antagonistic effect is, for example, PTH and calcitonin. PTH will increase the concentration of calcium in your blood back to normal level. Calcitonin will decrease your blood calcium back to normal level. So PTH is released in response to a drop of blood calcium. Calcitonin is released in response to a spike, increase in concentration in calcium in the blood. Same thing here, insulin and glucagon have opposite effect. Insulin will decrease glucose concentration in your blood. Glucagon will increase glucose concentration in your blood. So when your blood concentration of glucose spikes, increase, insulin is released. When blood glucose level drops in the blood, glucagon is released. So those are examples of opposite effect. We call it antagonistic effect. Synergistic effect means when epinephrine shows up, it will increase the heart, the rate of the heart. It will increase how fast your heart will beat. Norepinephrine does the same thing. But if you have both of them at the same time, the heart rate that is increases is more than both combined. So this is a synergistic effect. So let's say epinephrine increase the heart rate by 10 beats per minute. Norepinephrine does the same 10 beats per minute. If you add the two, if it's linear, then the heart rate increases 20 beats per minute. But in this case, if you have both of them showing up at the same time, the heart increase is like 50, 60 beats per minute. So it's much more than each one combined. We call that synergistic effect. Permissiveness effect means the presence of one hormone allows another hormone to function properly. So an example would be epinephrine dilating the bronchiolar smooth muscle, and it works very efficiently if the thyroid hormones is also present. Yeah. So that's, in that case, it's called permissiveness. Thyroid hormones are important also for growth hormones. So if you have growth hormone and you don't have thyroid hormone, your limbs would go, disproportionately. You might have one lower limb longer than the other one. You might have one upper limb longer than the other one. The reason why we grow proportionately, obvious due to growth hormone, but it requires a second player, and that's the thyroid hormones. So in the presence of thyroid hormones, the thyroid hormones allow the growth hormone to grow your body proportionally. That's another example of permissiveness effect. Now let's go over reflex, endocrine reflex. We have three types. We have the neural stimulus, we will talk about the second one is hormonal stimulus, and the third one humoral stimulus. So let's begin with the neural stimulus. And we saw a little bit about this already, the short-term stress scenario, right? This is the fight or flight situations. So under sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, ANS, autonomic nervous system, under short-term stress, like during vigorous exercise, asking someone's phone number, running late to class, being stressed during an exam, those are short-term stress. So the hypothalamus sends out neurons. These are called preganglionic motor fibers. And they are the fibers or axons wrapped in a nerve called splanchnic nerve. Then they go all the way down to the adrenal medulla. And since we have preganglionic neurons, you will learn in the nervous system, there should be a post-ganglionic neuron. In the case in the medulla, there's no post-ganglionic neurons. They are called chromaffin cells. So that's what we call them modified ganglia, a modified ganglion. So the adrenal medulla is an example of a modified ganglion. So containing, instead of post-ganglionic neurons, it contains chromaffin cells. And the chromaffin cells produce and release catecholamines into the bloodstream. E here stands for epinephrine. NE stands for norepinephrine, 80% of which are epinephrine, 20% of which are norepinephrine into the bloodstream. And what happens here is they will increase your heart. When you say heart, it increases the heart rate, so it will make your heart beat faster. They both induce the heart to beat faster, so they both increase the heart rate. They also both increase the contractility of the heart, meaning they will induce the heart to contract stronger, to pump out more blood, right? So the cardiac output will increase. They will make your lungs, they will induce your lungs, your pulmonary functionality. They will induce you to breathe faster. Also, the breath are deeper. They also increases gas exchange. And then the skeletal muscle, the blood vessels perfusing the skeletal muscles are dilated. So allowing increase in blood perfusion, meaning blood flow to the skeletal muscle will be increased. So there's more nutrients brought in, more oxygen brought in, and disposing more of carbon dioxide and cellular waste, because due to the fact that skeletal muscles, their activity has been increased due to your movement. So the body is ready for action, prepping for an emergency, right? That's under short-term stress. And that's an example of a neural stimulus when we talk about endocrine reflex. If we have short-term stress, we also have long-term stress. And long-term stress would be under another type of endocrine reflex. We call it hormonal stimulus. So this is under the hypothalamus, long-term stress, through hypophyseal system. We saw this briefly earlier. So the hypothalamus releases CRH, corticotropin releasing hormones, targeting the APG. APG stands for anterior pituitary gland. So once APG receives CRH, APG anterior pituitary releases into the bloodstream ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH uses the bloodstream, leaving the anterior pituitary at the base of the brain, going all the way down to the adrenal gland, specifically adrenal cortices. So the right adrenal cortex, the left adrenal cortex. And so those are the three families of your steroid hormones. They are essential for life, meaning if you have a traumatic injury and both adrenal cortices are completely damaged, completely lost, you have 24 hours to 48 hours to live. So without the adrenal cortices, we cannot sustain life. So this is crucial, right? So this is very, very important. These three families of steroid hormones, the mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, androgens, again, three families of steroid hormones, they are required for life. And this is under long-term stress. And when we say long-term stress, if you starve yourself because you want to lose weight, starvation, as far as the body is concerned, it's a long-term stress. It's a traumatic event. Physical trauma, meaning you have a traumatic tissue injury. It can be a bone fracture, it can be a skin burn, or it can be a mundane as a paper cut, right? A simple paper cut, as far as your body is concerned, that's a physical trauma. That's a long-term stress. Any sickness that you have, so when you are ill, you fall ill or you are sick, that's what I wrote down here, interleukin-1 macrophage, that stands for, sickness. That's also a long-term stress for the body. And we're going to talk about this relationship between interleukin and macrophage when we talk about the immune system. And then finally, the humoral, the third type of endocrine reflex. This stimulus is activated by electrolytes, by simple chemicals like potassium, calcium, or a fuel molecule like glucose, so simple chemicals. Let's begin with the glucose. So when blood glucose increases, like right after a meal, right? Your pancreas, more specifically, the beta cells or the beta pancreatic cells detects the spikes in blood glucose. They produce and they secrete insulin into the bloodstream. Insulin will go throughout the body and induce the body to absorb glucose. Without insulin, your systemic body cells cannot absorb glucose. So when the cells throughout your body pick up glucose, blood concentration glucose drops and it goes back through negative feedback again, right? So when blood glucose goes to a normal level, the pancreas stops releasing insulin. So there's a balance here. So the pancreas, the beta cells, constantly monitor the concentration of glucose 24/7. And later in the semester, there's a molecular mechanism that we need to understand and we need to know. How is it possible when glucose gets into a beta pancreatic cells? How does it know and how does it release insulin? That's a beautiful mechanism. But we have to wait until we get there to share that with you. So this is the case where blood glucose increase during or right after a meal. It involves insulin as a hormone. And insulin is a protein, right? It's a protein base used as a chemical messenger. So the cell would express the insulin gene. It goes through the rough endoplasmic reticulum, goes through the Golgi apparatus, and then it will be exported out of the cell through exocytosis. In the case where the opposite when blood glucose decreases, for example, between meals, when the concentration of blood glucose decrease, it is detected by another type of cells in the pancreas. Now it's being detected by the alpha cells of the pancreas. And the alpha cells, when they detect a decrease in the concentration of glucose in blood plasma, they release glucagon, which is another protein acting as a hormone, right? Glucagon will go to the liver. It will induce hepatocytes, meaning liver cells, to proceed to break down glycogen stores to release glucose back to the bloodstream to increase blood glucose. Okay? So when glucagon induces hepatocyte to break down glycogen, we call that glycolysis. And meaning glycogen is a polysaccharide, is being hydrolyzed to release glucose back into the bloodstream. And that concept, we're going to talk about it when we talk about metabolism toward the end of the semester in more detail. So that's for glucose. For potassium is over here. So when blood potassium increases, the adrenal cortex releases a steroid hormone called aldosterone, and it induces the kidney to expel potassium into the urine, so dropping blood concentration of potassium. And when blood concentration of potassium goes back to normal, it will induce the aldosterone adrenal cortex to stop releasing aldosterone. The mechanism is much more complicated than that, but this is enough for now until we hit the urinary system to show this the beautiful relationship between this aldosterone and other hormones implicating in maintaining electrolyte homeostasis. And then calcium. Let's begin with down here. So when concentration of calcium in our blood is low, the chief cells of the parathyroid glands releases parathyroid hormones, and the parathyroid hormones have three functions. It induces bone resorptions. In other words, it activates osteoclasts. So the osteoclasts resorb the bone to release calcium. It also diminish or decrease calcium loss through urinary output. So it makes us pee, excrete less calcium. And it also activates vitamin D into calcitriol, which is an activated form of vitamin D. And once vitamin D has been activated into calcitriol, calcitriol can increase calcium absorption through our digestive tract. In all three cases, they all contribute to bring back calcium level to homeostatic level in our blood. Every time we have calcium concentration drop, right? In the case of the calcium blood levels that are increasing, it only applies under two cases. When the woman is pregnant during pregnancies, or the child is actively growing. If you are a non-pregnant adult who has stopped growth post-puberty, you don't have this condition. So it's rare to have a high blood calcium level seen on non-pregnant post growth, post-puberty adults. And during pregnancies or children, the calcitonin has the opposite effect. So calcitonin shuts down osteoclasts, so it prevents resorption of bones because we have an excess of calcium. So in fact, it basically induces osteoblasts to store calcium into the bones. So whenever you have high blood calcium when you're growing up, if you have a kid who's still growing, he or she drinks milk, a lot of calcium, osteoblasts would be induced to store calcium in our bones because 99% of all our calcium is being deposited, being stored in our bones. So our bones is actually a bank, a savings account for our calcium. So when your body needs calcium, your bones will take a beating. So the body will basically resorb the bone to have calcium available for the body. Because we're going to learn later under excitable tissue, under the nervous system and the cardiovascular system, neuron function and muscle contraction, calcium is very, very important. So with that said, I will end today's recording and then I will see you again for the next recording. In the meantime, be safe out there, study well, make me proud for the next exam, and I will talk to you again soon. Take care until then.